We're going to pick up where we left off. Slave revolts in Virginia. So, slave revolts that occurred in the early 1800s to mid 1800s will ultimately tighten the slave codes, which we already know about the slave codes. We talked about that in the colonial period. The slave codes continue in the early new nation, and the emergence of a more strict Fugitive Slave Act in 1850, which I'm going to teach you about at the end of Lesson 9. Now, what you need to understand is this Fugitive Slave Act in 1850 was an expansion on the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793. This was passed by Congress and signed into law by Washington. This particular Fugitive Slave Act allowed slave owners to reclaim slaves if they did what? Left or ran away. All right? It also barred slaves from having a trial by what? Jury. Very good, because there were no protections in the Constitution of slaves, nor African Americans for that matter. So I want us to keep that in mind as we move forward today. So slave revolts in Virginia, there are two really significant ones that I want to point out. One led by this guy up here, Gabriel Prosser of Henrico County, and the other, this guy down here, Nat Turner in Southampton County. Both of these revolts had very different outcomes, but both of the revolts are going to start to sort of spread fear throughout the South, and they will also lead to an outcry for either tightening the slave codes and expanding on the Fugitive Slave Act, but it also leads to an outcry for an end to slavery. So we'll talk about that after I set the scene here. So this first slave revolt, Gabriel Prosser in Henrico County. A little bit about Gabriel Prosser. He was an enslaved artisan. He was a blacksmith by trade. He had gotten tangled in a number of different issues in his life that had resulted in horrible cruelty and punishment. But an event that pushed him over the edge was the accusation that Prosser had stolen a pig. Now, again, if you are accused of theft and you are convicted of theft, what is one way in which you might be punished? I'm not looking for execution here. Okay, you're on the right path. You would be branded. No. Remember we talked about the Spanish cut off hands when slaves didn't meet quotas, right? You were branded for theft, okay? Yeah. So, because of the slave codes and because of the Fugitive Slave Act, when Gabriel Prosser was accused of theft, he has no trial by jury, right? He has no legal defense. He's basically guilty until proven innocent, and he's found guilty, and he's branded and beaten, and this pushes him over the edge. So he decides to lead a slave revolt. This slave revolt is absolutely, the plan is absolutely wild. Here was the plan. Arm a group of fellow slaves in Henrico, march into Richmond, storm the Virginia state capitol, and kidnap the governor of Virginia, who was James Monroe at the time. That's a pretty bold strategy for a revolt. But there are two reasons that the revolt doesn't happen. Number one, heavy rains are going to prevent this revolt from happening because water gets up, and what major waterway separates Richmond from surrounding counties? the James, right? So they got a problem with getting across the little creeks, tributaries in the James to get to Richmond. The other issue, snitches, okay? So why would it be advantageous for a slave to roll over and snitch or be an informant about a possible revolt? They could be rewarded. Really, what it comes down to is they're mainly rewarded by not getting killed. Because what happens in a lot of these revolts is there are these sweeping executions, which we'll learn more about later, are called lynchings. This is an execution without a trial. And so if you turn someone in, then you're going to be spared, but you could be rewarded. So Prosser and his followers are going to ultimately be hunted down and executed, and the revolt doesn't go off. Now, the next one, led by this guy, Nat Turner, totally different outcome. Nat Turner was born around the time Prosser had planned his revolt in Southampton County, Virginia. He learned how to read at a very young age. He was very religious. When he was just a little bit older than you guys, he started preaching. Like in his late teens, early 20s, he starts preaching. They start hiring him out to other plantations to preach. And over time, he starts to get a larger congregation from these different plantations in Southampton County, and he starts to receive these visions where he believes that he's actually an instrument put on earth by God to bring about an end to slavery through force. He's waiting for a sign. The sign will come to him in the summer of 1831, which is a sign that we've all witnessed not too long ago. How many of us have experienced an eclipse, right? Solar eclipse. That's what happens here. And he and his followers are going to wreak havoc in Southampton County, killing somewhere between 50 and 60 people. Eventually, they will be hunted down, rounded up, tried, and executed. Now, Nat Turner's rebellion, again, starts to get people really scared that potentially a Haitian revolution might happen in the South. What happened in Haiti in the early 1800s? Very good. Who did they overthrow? What country had control of Haiti? France. Very good. Nice job. So there was this fear that there would be this massive slave revolution that would occur in the South. So some people wanted harsher laws passed, tightening the slave codes, expanding on the Fugitive Slave Act, where some Southerners actually proposed to end slavery in the South. There were people in Virginia that were like, hey, maybe we should just get rid of this. But over time, Southerners and Virginians who favored abolition were intimidated into silence. Your options, if you were an abolitionist in the South, were be quiet or move to the North. That was pretty much it. There's also a large slave revolt that occurred in New Orleans in 1811. It rivaled Nat Turner's rebellion. Historians go back and forth on which one was the largest. They were both pretty substantial. And then Denmark Vesey led a slave revolt in Charleston, South Carolina in 1822. But it's documented that nearly 200 slave revolts occurred in America in the early 1800s. Some were small, and a lot of them weren't recorded, and historians found out about them years later. This is a publication of the Nat Turner Rebellion, and that publication was widespread. It was published all over the place in America. Questions up to this point? Is everybody good? All right. So early American abolitionism. In 1817, the American Colonization Society, the ACS, was founded by Reverend Robert Finley. He was a Presbyterian minister for the purpose of transporting African Americans, air quotes, back to Africa. Why is that ridiculous? They're American. Okay? They are African by ancestry. They are American by birth, right? Most of these people had never been to Africa. Some of them were generations in as Americans. So in 1822, the Republic of Liberia was founded for free African Americans to resettle and live. But there's strings attached here, right? Free African Americans. This isn't to say that enslaved Africans or African Americans were liberated and sent to Liberia. So if you were free, born free, or emancipated, you have this opportunity. So the capital of Liberia was named Monrovia in honor of President James Monroe, who supported the program. Other supporters, people like Andrew Jackson, Henry Clay, John Randolph of Virginia. Now, a number of African Americans start to think, like, what's the lesser of the two evils here? Do I stay and have no rights, or do I go and not only have freedom and rights, but when I go, what can these people do when they get there? What happens, like, if they leave, if this group of people leave and they go to this new land, well, they will have something. They'll have land. They'll have the ability to vote. They will have the ability to create their own government. See where I'm going with this? What tragically happens with Liberia is a very ironic downward spiral. So, yeah, bless you. So, what happens with Liberia is it's like estimated that about 16,000 African Americans go. The numbers are varied. They're as low as 11,000, they're as high as 16,000. So I gave you the high number. They get there. Do they have anything in common with the surrounding tribal people of Africa? They do not. So what institutions do you think these people put into place? Yes. And then that ultimately leads to what? War. And it's going to be devastating. That's a story for a different day, though. Some really horrific civil war unfolds in Liberia as a result. All right. So one interesting individual involved here, Henry Highland Garnett, former slave from Maryland, abolitionist, alumnus of the Oneida Institute, which was one of the first institutions to provide higher education for African Americans in the U.S. and New York. He went on to serve as ambassador to Liberia in 1881. He's also the first African American to address Congress. He spoke to Congress at the end of the Civil War to promote and support the passage of the 13th Amendment. Sadly, though, Garnett will get over there, and within a year of his time as ambassador, he dies of malaria. So, pretty rough situation. By 1860, most African American slaves were native-born Americans because what had been outlawed in America and by most European countries by the 18 teens and 20s. What had most European nations and even America outlawed? Not reproduction. You're on the transatlantic slave trade. And what's really nuts, by the 1830s, Britain abolished slavery in its colonies. Think about that. It's pretty wild. That's not to say that there weren't people that were illegally doing this. For sure, people were still trying to get away with this and breaking the law and were involved in the transatlantic slave trade, but overwhelmingly, this had been tamped down by the early to mid 1800s. So, as you all know, abolitionism really took off during the Second Great Awakening. A really important individual in this story is a guy by the name of Theodore Dwight Weld. He was the husband of suffragist and abolitionist Angelina Grimke. He was also one of the key leaders of the abolitionist movement. He was inspired by Reverend Charles Grandison Finney. Remember him from last class? He's the guy that was the father of the Second Great Awakening, devout abolitionist. He brought about the modern revival during the Second Great Awakening. Weld preached against slavery and wrote, with the help of his sister-in-law, Sarah, and his wife, Angelina Grimke, the 1839 book, American Slavery as It Is, Testimony of 1,000 Witnesses. What makes this book so important is that what Weld does is he takes firsthand accounts of people who survived the slave system and were able to talk about it or even write about it. He's basically giving those without a voice because most of these African Americans, due to the slave codes, did not have the ability to do what? What could they not do by law, legally? That would have required him to give them a voice. They couldn't do that. They couldn't even read or write. They were illiterate by law, right? Now, we obviously know that a number of former slaves and free African Americans will get an education, but it's in its infancy right now, all right? Weld's book will also inspire Harriet Beecher Stowe to write the anti-slavery bestseller, Uncle Tom's Cabin, which I'm going to talk about in more detail a little bit later today. Any questions about early American abolition? All right. So on the left, we have Sarah Grimke. In the center, we have Angelina Grimke. And on the right, we have Theodore Dwight Weld. What made these two women very unique, where were they from? Very good. They were from South Carolina. They grew up on a plantation. Had they not had to go to Philadelphia for their father's health, he got really ill and they had to send him to Philly to see more experienced and advanced doctors, they might not have gotten tied into the abolitionist movement. And then Angelina and Weld will marry, and they become sort of like a bit of an abolitionist suffrage power couple during this era. So let's talk a little bit about radical abolitionism. Without a doubt, the most radical abolitionist of the era was William Lloyd Garrison. On January 1st, 1831, Garrison publishes The Liberator. The Liberator was one of the most widely circulated abolitionist newspapers in America. It was banned in the South, but it was widely circulated in the North. What he will trigger is a 30-year war of words to bring about an end to the institution of slavery. This is a quote from his first publication. I am in earnest. I will not equivocate. I will not excuse. I will not retreat a single inch, and I will be heard. The greatest African American abolitionist of the era, without a doubt, is Frederick Douglass. Born Frederick Bailey in Maryland, escaped slave, who goes on to work with William Lloyd Garrison. Now, he is a contributing writer in Garrison's newspaper, and while he is writing for Garrison, he will publish one of the greatest books in American history, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass. This depicts his life as a slave. It is beautifully written, extremely articulate, and I highly recommend that you read it at some point in your life, if you have the opportunity, which, again, I continue to promote American Lit. You should think about it, all right? He will ultimately break away from Garrison and go on to establish his own newspaper, the North Star. What is the meaning behind that name? Yeah, it guides slaves to freedom. Very good. He works with another prominent abolitionist by the name of Martin Delany. Has anyone ever heard of him before? So, Martin Delany, we're going to talk more about him later when we move into the Civil War and the post-Civil War era. This is a quote from Douglass. I have observed in my experience of slavery that whenever my condition was improved, instead of it increasing my contentment, it only increased my desire to be free and set me to thinking of plans to gain my freedom. Now, what you guys need to understand, like any major civil rights movement, not everybody sees eye to eye. So Garrison and Douglass ultimately start to drift and splinter. Garrison was far more radical than Douglass. Garrison rejected the Constitution. Garrison was calling for civil war. Garrison was calling for the secession of the North. Douglass was saying we should use the Constitution. We should try to do this if we can without war. This is not anything new, and it will happen again. In all of our major civil rights movements, there are different points of view, right? Like when we get into the post-Civil War era, we'll see different points of view from W.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington. When we get into the modern civil rights movement, we'll see different points of view from Dr. King and Malcolm X. So again, not everybody's going to see eye to eye, okay? In 1835, Garrison narrowly escaped death, being beaten by a mob and dragged through the streets of Boston for publicly burning a copy of the Constitution. So again, pretty radical. I did add this for you guys, so you might want to make note of this. In 1836, Congress, notably the House of Representatives, used the gag rule to prohibit discussion and debate over anti-slavery petitions. So again, they're trying to keep that free state, slave state balance. But ultimately, it's going to carry us to war. All right, so on the left, we have William Lloyd Garrison. On the right, Frederick Douglass. Garrison, author of The Liberator. Douglass, editor and author of the North Star. I'm also going to talk about another event that very much divided these guys that we'll talk about here momentarily. All right, so abolitionist impact of the North. Not everyone was in favor of the Garrisonian tactics. I also want you all to understand that we cannot look at the North and the South prior to and during the Civil War as a monolith. And what I mean by that is, not everyone in the North wanted to end slavery. There were plenty of people in the North that were perfectly happy with slavery in the South, because what did the North depend on the South to produce? Very good. Raw materials and agriculture. Notably, what crop? Cotton and, yes, tobacco for sure. It always comes back to tobacco. But definitely cotton, okay? So this whole free state, slave state balance becomes sort of like a rallying cry for the lukewarm northern abolitionist or the lukewarm like non-abolitionists to the north. Hey, let's make sure we don't allow slavery to spread, right? But then you got more radical voices like, hey, let's bring this thing to an end. But not everybody is like as radical as Garrison, so it's tricky on what camp they're going to fall into. So, because of this, we see a new group form as a result, the American Anti-Slavery Society. Wendell Phillips, one of the most notable anti-slavery abolitionists of the time, became known as the Golden Trumpet of the abolitionist cause. He also fought for the rights of women's suffrage and publicly fought for the rights of Native Americans. He refused to wear cotton or eat sugar because it was produced by slaves. David Walker, tremendously important abolitionist from this era. He was actually born free in Wilmington, North Carolina. He bounced around all over the place. He was in Charleston for a while, Philly, all over. He wrote one of the most influential pamphlets for the abolitionist cause. It was called Appeal. It was very much inspired by the writings of Olaudah Equiano. Do you remember Equiano? He was the guy that gave us one of our few accounts of what horrible trip across the Atlantic. The Middle Passage, very good. Harriet Tubman, escaped slave from Maryland, goes on to become a leading conductor on the Underground Railroad, the system of safe houses to get slaves to freedom. It's estimated that she rescued as many as 300 slaves and brought them to freedom. She will play a huge role in the Civil War as a spy. She'll serve as a nurse. She is instrumental in the suffrage movement after the war. Henry Box Brown mailed himself to freedom from Richmond to Philly. We're going to talk a little bit more about him as we move forward today. Also, abolitionists' outspoken hatred of the institution of slavery led to mob violence, the destruction of private property, and in some cases, the death of abolitionists. So, for example, Lewis Tappan, his home in New York was burned to the ground and looted because he was in favor of the freedom of the slaves aboard the Amistad. Has anyone ever heard of the Amistad before? Okay, a little bit about the Amistad. The Amistad was a slave ship that the slaves overthrew in the early 1800s. Now, the transatlantic slave trade had been outlawed in America, and most European countries by this time had moved away from the transatlantic slave trade. So when these slaves wind up landing in New England, they're going to sue for their freedom. And the guy that defends them in the court case is going to be John Quincy Adams. And they actually win their freedom. It's a pretty remarkable story. One of the early martyrs of the abolitionist cause, Elijah P. Lovejoy of Alton, Illinois, his printing press was destroyed 4 times, and ultimately a mob killed him for his views on abolition. So some abolitionists like Garrison and the Garrisonians, as they were called, started to call for civil war. We're actually going to learn about a really radical abolitionist in the next part of the lesson by the name of John Brown. He was the guy that we looked at the very start of the lesson. The abolitionists also started to get involved in politics. The Liberty Party is formed in 1840. One of their leading backers is Salmon P. Chase. By the early 1840s, a new anti-slavery political party is formed and led by a guy named Charles Sumner. It's known as the Free Soil Party. And then ultimately, the remnants of these two parties are going to wind up under the umbrella of the Republican Party, the same party we know today. Their platform looked very different when they were first established. Thank you much. So, I do find it important, though, for you to understand that the South will lash back. They will establish their own propaganda campaign to try to convince the North that the slave system is great. They'll publish artwork and political cartoons showing the life of the happy slaves. There's one that's really eerie, and it shows the slave family sitting around outside a cabin playing music together and dancing and having fun. Well, that's a farce because the nuclear family was not acknowledged in the slave codes. That was one of the most horrific and detrimental things about all this. The nuclear family was ripped apart in the slave system. So on the top left, we have Wendell Phillips. That's Lewis Tappan, Elijah P. Lovejoy, Harriet Tubman, and then that's Henry Box Brown. This was another issue that divided Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison. William Lloyd Garrison wanted this event to be widely publicized. Why would Frederick Douglass not want that? Any ideas? Yes. Frederick Douglass is like, if we publicize this and rub it in the South's face, then that means they're going to start searching every box on every port looking for people that are trying to escape. But they publicize it, and that's exactly what happens. This is where I'm going to pump the brakes today. Uncle Tom's Cabin and 12 Years a Slave. Harriet Beecher Stowe, wife of a New England clergyman and abolitionist, sister of Catherine Beecher, who was a crusader for women in education during the Reform era, wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin in 1852. She was inspired by a variety of different events. She was inspired by Theodore Dwight Weld. She was inspired after visiting Cincinnati and seeing slavery firsthand in Kentucky. This novel becomes an absolute bestseller. It also becomes banned in the South and in some places in the North. And what happens when we ban books? What do people want to do? They want to read them, right? This isn't even the most articulately, brilliantly, beautifully written novel of its era. But it's widely circulated, and it's a bestseller. We don't know if he actually said this or not, but it is rumored that upon meeting Harriet Beecher Stowe, Abraham Lincoln said, "You are the little woman who started this great war." Well, she didn't really start the Civil War, but she turned a lot of heads with the publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin. Far more gripping, in my opinion, than Uncle Tom's Cabin is Solomon Northup's memoir, 12 Years a Slave. A little bit about Solomon Northup. Solomon Northup was a free man living in Saratoga, New York. We're all familiar with Saratoga, right? Turning point of the Revolution. He was a skilled carpenter and a brilliant violinist. A couple of men approached him and said, "Oh my God, you're an awesome violinist. We would love to hire you to play a show in Washington, D.C." He decides to go. He goes down. He plays the gig. They celebrate. And he wakes up. He's been drugged. He's sold into slavery. And he will be a slave on a cotton plantation in Louisiana for 12 years. Has anyone seen the film 12 Years a Slave? It will rip your heart and soul out of your chest. It is one of, if not the most gripping film that you'll ever watch if you decide to watch it. And really captures what he wrote in this memoir. So these are two very influential books that carry us into the American Civil War. And that is where our talk breaks today. Do you guys have any questions for me? Is everybody good? Cool. All right. So